What if Baki Hanma, the battle prodigy, took on the Chūnin exams? Does he pass, or does he get blown out the water from these superpowered ninjas? Let's talk about it. I saw this video topic from a guy named Longtails. He makes some great content, and he did this topic with Kid Goku, so I thought I'd try and put my own spin on it with a different series. I'll leave his video down in the description, but without further ado, let's get into the discussion. So starting off with the written exam, this isn't too relevant to the discussion, as the whole goal of the written test was for Genin to cheat and apply critical thinking, with the Baki attempting to get the entirety of the group to concede before the last question, which, if the Genin opt to take, have the ability to become Chūnin. Baki really wouldn't have any issues with this test, as it's a test of will, and even if you had the entirety of the written test blank, you can still pass without answering even a single question. Baki, having taken on the likes of Yujiro, who on top of being stronger and more skilled than Baki, can incite fear on a cellular level to the point that even without his aura being visible, he's still able to make hardened veterans crack. So not answering questions and being pressured into failing is not going to be an issue for Baki, who's just beyond excited at the prospect of fighting stronger opponents. Next up, we have the Forest of Death. I would also say the Forest of Death wouldn't present anything that's far outside of what Baki has dealt with in his own series, as Baki has done extensive training in the Hida Mountains, and for those who say, well, that may not be that impressive as the Forest of Death, Baki literally trained himself by throwing himself off cliffs, very reminiscent of Naruto summoning Gamabunta and that whole interaction. We even see Baki making even a rival of the Yashizaru, a giant ape who is shown to have the ability to even kill a bear, with Baki just blatantly overpowering the ape at one of his weakest points in the series. Baki would also just scale to Yujiro, who has literally ran the fades of every animal on the planet, including a rampaging monster elephant that even the US would not be able to take down. Baki would be leagues ahead of this experience at his current point and would have no issues with any of the wildlife in the forest, barring any ninja he may be forced to fight against, which we won't mention too much as that gets more into the meat of the video, that being the preliminaries. If you really want to take it there, the giant tigers in the Forest of Death just aren't going to present that many issues. For some perspective, Baki does a form of image training where he perfectly imagines an individual or being, with him being able to replicate their attributes, having the images actually deal damage to him. If you want some perspective, an image of his father Yujiro shook a city block, but for the context that we're talking about here, Baki performed this feat and beat 1v1 a giant praying mantis. The animals just are not going to be presenting that much of an issue for him. Baki does have a lot that would aid him though against many of the problems in the forest, having resistances to most poisons due to a similar biology to Yujiro, extraordinary senses, emphasized with him being able to hear Musashi's heartbeat from many miles away while underground, and he could identify this heartbeat not belonging to anybody he knows. This also goes for his perception as well. Baki's able to sense opponents in completely different rooms, so it's very unlikely that anybody's getting the drop on Baki at this point. If anything, you could make a case Baki may be getting the drop on some of these lower level ninjas. If Baki ever did struggle during the forest, he'd simply need to actually release his endorphins. Endorphins, for those who don't know, is a collection of opioid-like neurochemicals scattered throughout the nervous system, which have a profound effect on the neurohormonal regulatory mechanisms of the brainstem and all that controls. This cited by the National Library of Medicine. Now, to put that in layman's terms, if you ever heard of the term runner's high, that's an example of these hormones being released. It's essentially a short-lasting, deeply euphoric state that, while very rare, is something Baki has trained to be able to release when he desires so. For Baki, this is essentially boost certain attributes such as durability and pain resistance. Baki can also just twist his right ear to induce this effect. This essentially means that any amount of fatigue or general animals in the forest would generally not pose too much of an issue for Baki. He'd more than likely be able to pass the Forest of Death with pretty low difficulty. The only difficult point for him would be the scrolls, but again, any low level Genin shouldn't present that many issues for him at this point. Now for the preliminaries, because this is what everyone's kind of been waiting for, and this is what Baki characters ironically live for, the smoke. Now, I'll be putting Baki up against a diverse group of individuals to give us an idea of how he'll do in the bracket. Starting off, let's put him against one of the juggernauts of the Chūnin exam, Gaara. Now, but looking at Baki versus Gaara, it's kind of interesting as we need to establish a bit of a speed scale for Gaara's sand and Baki's speed. Luckily, we do have some accepted calcs done on Gaara's sand speed based on the assassination attempt on his life when he was younger, where Gaara's sand reacts to a point-blank explosion. There's essentially three interpretations of this feat. There's a low end, mid end, and high end, with the highest speed reached being Mach 51. This calc is also more conservative as it doesn't account for Gaara's automatic sand defense increasing its speed as he gets older and stronger, but either way, considering Gaara isn't the type of fighter to train at this point, it just shouldn't matter too much. Now for Baki, we have a few measurements that would actually put him above these speed ranges. For starters, we have Kakukayo stating that with his Mach punch, he'd be able to reach 1,000 miles per minute, which is approximately Mach 78.88, who Baki should scale to or just objectively above. The Mach punch being quite literally what it sounds like, a Mach speed punch. which is also impressive for a lot of characters, as in the exam, the sound ninja who use sound-based attacks are extremely threatening to most of the cast at this point. Baki would also fit this tier based on calcs done on casual feats such as Yujiro blitzing a group of officers that were watching him at several dozens of meters away, with the feat being calced at Mach 37. So Baki fits pretty comfortably into this range to above. This would also make it that he would perform similarly to base Lee against Gaara, just being too fast for the likes of Gaara Sand to catch. There is a problem, however, in which that we run into the issue where being faster than Gaara doesn't equate to an automatic win as displayed with Lee. Gaara has a layer of sand armor shielding his body, along with the ability to use his gourd as a cushion if push comes to shove, even surviving the likes of the 5th gate. So we have to look at a couple things. We have to look at how durable Gaara is, and does Baki actually have the strength to damage Gaara at this point past his sand defenses. Gaara's durability at this point would be in the city block level plus to multi-city block level, as he would scale multiple times above the Sasuke's fireball calc placed at the city block level due to it vaporizing the ground. The databook entry of the ground also supports this interpretation, with Gaara being able to survive a pounding. Oh no, no. From 5th gate Lee, who's tens to dozens of times stronger. Even if you didn't want to go off the fireball interpretation, Lee would also scale above Sasuke beating a giant bear, which is also a city block level feat. So maybe if you weren't a fan of looking at the fireball as a measure, there is a physical stat that we can use. You could probably even infer for Gaara that small town to town might not actually be that outside his range at this point in the series, but that's more so dependent on how you view Lee's multipliers with the gates. This really wouldn't matter too much regardless, since Baki isn't that far off. Can Baki hit this hard? Well, there's a couple reference points we could use that help us gauge where Baki is. We actually have 2 city block level calcs for Baki, both actually being really good feats for Baki, as one is an imaginary version of Yujiro shaking an entire city block, a literal image version of a fighter in Baki's mind. Shakes a block. Yeah, I know. With the same Yujiro shaking an entire skyscraper with his aura alone. The fact that Baki is already in somewhat of a comparable range with these 2 feats that aren't physical feats at all is pretty good. Now, if you are under the impression that Baki would scale to Yujiro stopping an earthquake, it would scale directly to this range, as the low end for Yujiro stopping that earthquake is multi-city block level, with the mid end being town level, the high end being large town level. This being a much weaker version of Yujiro, who stated to always be getting stronger, always improving. Baki is comparable to a much stronger version of this Yujiro who's had years of constant improvement, meaning it's not that much of a stretch to say that the current Baki would scale to this feat. And if not in base, with his demon back, which is an amp on all of Baki's stats, increasing his strength many times over. And although it's not exactly quantifiable, it's clear as an increase of at least 2 to 3 times, as every encounter it's used, it puts the user objectively above individuals or techniques they were struggling with in base. An example being when Yujiro ceased taking damage from Kakukao's offensive Shiori strikes, which normally produce enough force to shatter walls, with Yujiro also just being forced to dodge these strikes. From there, Baki would be quite literally doing what Lee did, with none of the physical repercussions, far more mix-ups, and pretty much limitless options for Baki. If you wanted an in-character move he would do, even if you argued Gaara's Sand Cloak would actually allow him to tank Baki's blows, Baki could actually perform a graze-like punch, a skin punch almost, that essentially grazes the skin of the opponent's jaw, and through 1 to 3 multiple blows if needed, the opponent's brain begins to bounce around and concuss. This working on an opponent with an abnormally strong neck, even by these 2 character standards, so it should be effective on Gaara, as it ignores his sand armor entirely, focusing on Gaara's insides. Baki also has techniques such as the cord cut, which he uses against Jack Hanma. This technique allows the fighter to sever the opponent's cords with their finger, allowing Baki to sever the nerves responsible for the use of limbs. It's even a possible status effect, as Baki was able to use it to cut Jack Hanma's optical nerves. The only chance Gaara would have is if Baki does play around too much and get caught in maybe a sand clone or caught in a sand coffin, in which case, even if Gaara's sand doesn't permanently play him down, he could suffocate Baki to the point of submission, but even then, it's just not as likely, as when he gets Lee is suffering drawbacks from using the gates. So if you think Gaara is more durable, Baki has ways to get around this. What about someone like Ino and her mind transfer? Would this technique be effective on Baki? Well, a case could be made for Ino restraining Baki mentally, but the mind transfer does travel in a linear direction. Ino has to move her hands and have the technique activate while she can perceive the target. And even someone like Sakura wasn't immediately taken down with this technique, despite Sakura being far inferior than base Lee in speed. So it's pretty much nigh impossible for Ino to really hit this technique, as Baki would just be way too fast for it. But let's say Baki's just chilling. He's like, all right, I want to see what you got. And she actually does land the technique on Baki. It's actually unlikely that this would restrain Baki. Now, part of the reason Sakura was actually able to get out of it in the first place was due to Ino being low on chakra from attempting the technique prior. But even if she does, she's not low on chakra. Baki has actually shown shown something similar to Sakura's inner self with a form of projection, as when his pulse actually stopped and he died, he projected his willpower to bring himself back to life. This is also being replicated against Yujiro, with Baki's will being what actually makes Yujiro concede he is the strongest as opposed to his strength. So even if she takes over his body, Baki's will actually might just force her right back out. But this is, could be somewhat debatable. I will say though, this is a very unlikely scenario, as more often than not, he would just like smack her in the face with a jab. He'd be way too fast for even her to try this win condition. What about someone like Rock Lee? You know, probably one of the biggest juggernauts, at least at this point in this series. And I'll start by saying this: Rock Lee's fighting style is just not going to be enough for Baki. This guy has taken on far more diverse martial arts in his own verse, even shown the ability to copy and adopt countless techniques instantly with near mastery almost immediately after. So Lee's just not going to out martial arts, outbox Baki. Even his drunken fist, known for its unorthodox movements, wouldn't be anything outside normal for Baki. Baki would just instantly copy his fighting style and replicate anything Lee could do, probably better than Lee himself could. Lee in this case would clearly need to, take off the weights and use the gates.
But I'm not a rapper.
Now the gates, we do know, offer a strength increase of dozens of times. To be extremely conservative, I will just say 12 to 24 times, and this will become more clear in a second. Going off our earlier calcs, if base Rock Lee was above this Mach 25 speed threshold, with his physical stats increasing dozens of times for each subsequent gate, this would essentially mean that Lee would peer into that massively hypersonic range, which is Mach 100 through 1000. And this essentially puts him a bit too fast for Baki characters. And the reason I'm going with the range is that I will also add too that this is predetermined on Baki letting Lee power up with the gates, which Baki's actually very willing to do in character, even changing from a winning style to a less effective one to beat an opponent via raw strength over skill. The only way you can make the case that Baki may actually be able to react and deal with the likes of Lee in the 4th to 5th gate is if you believe he scales to Yujiro's hypothetical lightning dodge. There are a lot of variables with this feat and calculations done on it that make it difficult to use. The feat itself is a massively hypersonic feat, but even then, like where exactly it lies is very debatable. If you actually did go off this, however, you could make the case he might be able to react to a more conservative version of 4th to 5th gate Lee. However, just due to the extensive variables, it's just very difficult to say. The reasoning this would also be above Baki is that the gates absolutely trump any demon back or endorphins multiplier that you could put on Baki, meaning that even with any moves that enhance Baki's speed or abilities, it's just not going to happen. However, I will say, base Lee at the beginning of the start of this fight just absolutely gets clowned by Baki. He's either just going to jab his chin and knock him out once. He has the strength for it. And Baki does have moves that amplify his speed, like the cockroach tackle, the mock punch. Baki actually even attaining the ability to move in the 0.5 seconds that people are unconscious. For those who don't know, there is a period of time when a person is triggered but still unconscious and able to react to something, and that time frame is 0.5 seconds. That lets the brain throw an order, the neurons to fire, and the action to come. This means that between when the person is triggered and when the person is conscious, they're unconscious for 0.5 seconds. Baki has actually mastered the ability to move during this 0.5 seconds, so you could even make the case that he'll be able to move in certain instances that a lot of these fighters just haven't. It's more so that Lee might actually just outstat Baki at this point, depending on how you perceive the gate multipliers and the increases in strength, along with where exactly you scale Baki in speed. But I will say, most, if not all of these fighters in their base forms just really wouldn't present too many problems for Baki, assuming that he is just going for an objective win and not letting them kind of get off these win conditions or some of their jutsu. And I will say too, Baki's extremely fallible. There are times when his opponent will just catch him by surprise with something he's never seen before, and he will lose by it. So he does kind of have to take this a bit more seriously, as these are all opponents who are in a comparable range to him and do have abilities that are very threatful to him. I mean, not all of them, of course. Like Neji blocking his Tenketsu doesn't mean anything because he doesn't have a chakra network and stuff like that. So, you know, you could obviously argue it, but I figured these are some of the better fighters to talk about, some of the more interesting ones. Let me know what you guys think down below, how Baki does in the Chūnin exams, how far you think he gets and why. If you guys enjoyed the video, maybe want to see some more cross-verse stuff or more Baki, Naruto stuff on the channel, maybe a sequel to this video with Baki versus the characters in the finals, or how far Baki gets in Naruto. Let me know if you guys enjoyed the video. I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.